A mystical inquiry, the dissolution of the seer. On the moment perception touches God, and vanishes into silence. There is a threshold that few dare approach, and fewer still survive with their certainties intact. It is the threshold where the eye that looks for God begins to lose its edges, where the mind that seeks the absolute finds itself unraveling into the very thing it sought. This is not metaphor. This is the most literal truth that mysticism has ever whispered into the ears of those who had the courage to go still. All traditions have circled this threshold. The Sufi calls it fana, annihilation. The Buddhist speaks of the dissolution of the self-sense. The apophatic Christian, like Meister Eckhart, insists that God is known only in unknowing, that the soul must become empty as a desert before the divine can enter. Different languages, one ruthless fact. The eye that cannot see itself. Perception, by its very nature, requires a perceiver and a perceived. There must be a subject here and an object there, a gap, a distance, a relationship maintained across some invisible membrane. This is how we navigate the world of forms. The eye sees the tree, the hand touches the stone, the mind grasps the concept. Distance is the condition of all ordinary knowing. But what happens when perception turns toward the source of all perception? What happens when the eye attempts to see the light that makes all seeing possible? The instrument itself is made of what it is trying to examine. There is no distance left to maintain. The membrane dissolves, and in that dissolution, the perceiver does not find God. The perceiver becomes the finding, and then ceases to be anything separate at all. When perception approaches God, it dissolves into nothingness. Its boundaries are lost, it spreads out into infinity, and every content within it is extinguished. It becomes one with silence. This is the first and deepest mystery, that the movement toward the divine is simultaneously a movement toward one's own disappearance. Not death, but something stranger and more complete than death. A vanishing that leaves no absence behind, because the vanishing itself was always what the seeker was. The silence that has no name. Silence, in the mystical sense, is not merely the absence of sound. It is the absence of the one who would hear silence. Ordinary silence still has a listener, someone standing in a quiet room, aware of the quiet. The silence that is meant here is prior to that. It is the ground from which all sound and all silence alike emerge. A silence so total that it cannot be contrasted with noise, because there is no one left inside it to make the contrast. The great paradox is this. The mind cannot know this silence, because the mind itself is a kind of noise. Every thought, even the thought, "I am approaching silence," is a disturbance in the field, a ripple that announces, "Someone is here." And the moment someone is here, the threshold remains uncrossed. Infinity waits, patient and immovable, on the other side of the last thought. What crosses that threshold is not something we carry, but something we shed. The content of perception, all memories, beliefs, images of God, spiritual achievements, accumulated wisdom, every last item must be laid down. Not because these things are worthless, but because they are things. And infinity has no room for things. It already contains them. It is already everything. The traveler who arrives carrying anything has not yet arrived. Those who know do not speak. Here we must speak a hard truth about the landscape of religious and spiritual life as it actually exists in the world. Everywhere there are teachers, prophets, gurus, priests, mystics, and sages who speak fluently, sometimes brilliantly, about God. Their words can be beautiful, evocative, even illuminating. We do not dismiss them carelessly, but we must ask, with genuine seriousness, what are they actually describing? The one who has truly touched the threshold, the one in whom perception has dissolved into infinity, returns without anything to report. Not because the experience was vague or uncertain, but because the very faculty required for reporting ceased to function at the moment of contact. There was no observer remaining to take notes. The camera was consumed by the light it aimed at. What returns is not information about God. What returns is a person who has been, in some irreversible way, undone and remade by an encounter they cannot translate. Such a person will often speak less, not more. Their words become careful, spare, filled with negations. Not this, not that, not even this negation. The via negativa, the way of saying what God is not a rhetorical strategy. It is the honest report of someone who learned, at cost, that every positive statement about the divine is already a betrayal of it. The shadows of the mind. What, then, are the grand theological systems, the doctrines, the revealed scriptures, the elaborate maps of heaven and hell? What are the prophets' visions, the saints' ecstasies, the theologians' careful proofs? If the divine truly dissolves all content upon contact, what is the status of everything that has ever been said about it? They are shadows, but not in a dismissive sense. A shadow is real. A shadow tells you that something is there, that a light is present, that an object stands between the source and the surface. The shadow is not the object, and it is certainly not the light. But it is not nothing. It is evidence. It points. It gestures toward a reality it cannot contain. The tragedy is when the shadow is mistaken for the substance. When the doctrine becomes the divine. When the map becomes the territory. When the word God, uttered confidently, wielded authoritatively, repeated in sacred texts and marble halls, is taken to actually carry God within it, rather than merely pointing, imperfectly, toward an opening that language cannot enter. Those who talk about God are telling the shadows of their minds, the accumulated images, inherited beliefs, emotional textures of their particular biography, their culture's particular fever dream of the ultimate. This is not an insult. It is an observation. The shadow of a great tree is still a great shadow. But the one who naps in the shadow and believes they are napping in the tree lives in a sweet confusion that will eventually cost them the tree itself. The sad paths of desire. And what of those who say they follow the way of God? Who organize their lives around obedience to a divine will, who follow a spiritual discipline, who claim to walk a sacred path? Here too we must be careful and honest. The ways of God, insofar as that phrase can mean anything, cannot be reduced to any behavioral code, any institutional affiliation, any practice, however ancient or revered. What most people follow, when they say they follow God, is a system that answers their deepest needs. The need for meaning, for belonging, for moral clarity, for the comfort of being watched over by a benevolent intelligence. These are real and serious human needs. They are not to be mocked. But they are human needs. They are the shape of our longing, and our longing is not the same as its object. The path carved by desire leads always to a destination shaped by desire. It is a circular journey. The God found at the end of the path of wanting is a God who wanted to be found, which means a God assembled from our specifications. This is not the God who waits at the threshold where perception dissolves. That God has no interest in being found. That God is not a destination. That God is the disappearance of the one who was looking. The return to the ordinary. There is, in all of this, a kind of mercy. The threshold that dissolves perception does not demand that we stand there forever. In fact, it cannot be stood at for long. The human being is not built for permanent residence in the infinite. Life pulls us back. The body is hungry. Someone we love is grieving. The bread needs to be baked and the child needs to be held. What changes, for those who have approached and been unmade and returned, is not what they believe, but how they stand inside not knowing. They become comfortable with the silence at the center of all speaking. They hold their own thoughts lightly, as provisional arrangements rather than final truths. They speak about God, if they speak at all, with a tenderness and an uncertainty that sounds almost like grief. Grief for all the things they cannot say, grief for the vastness that language so persistently betrays. This is perhaps the only trustworthy sign. Not eloquence, not certainty, not the confident architecture of a theological system, but a certain quality of quiet. A willingness to not know that is not despair but its opposite, a wide, undefended openness to whatever is actually here, before we name it, before we claim it, before we make it small enough to carry. What remains when everything goes? In the end, the mystic's testimony is not about God. It is about the disappearance of the mystic. Every authentic account, from the Desert Fathers to the Zen masters, from Ibn Arabi to Simone Weil, converges on this single point, that the encounter with the Absolute is an encounter with one's own nothingness. Not as humiliation, as release. What remains when everything goes, when the boundaries dissolve, when the content is extinguished, when the perceiver has spread out into infinity, is not a vacuum. It is a fullness too complete to be grasped by the hands of description. The silence is not empty. It is the source of all sound. The nothingness is not absence. It is the ground from which every something arises, moment by moment, in what we call the world. So perhaps this is what we may say, and even this is too much, but let it be offered with appropriate trembling. God is what is left when even God is let go of. The way is the willingness to abandon every way. And the knowing is nothing less than the dissolution of the knower, into that which was always already here, vast and still, before the first question was formed, and after the last word falls silent.